Okay, so today we are going to continue on in our series Deeper, and we've been talking about initiating, with God, with the faith that we have. Now, somebody, in fact, it was Jen because she put it on Instagram this last week, on our New Wine Instagram. She put this thing right here and put her notes that she had taken on it, and that was really appreciated. I love when people take notes and they remember what I said. But this is an important, thing to understand, because one of the biggest hiccups, no matter if you're an intellectual or just a regular person, one of the biggest hiccups people have with getting their relationship started with Jesus or starting to follow Christ, or however you want to describe what your Christianity is that they believe that you've got to have it all worked out before you start. We have a good friend of mine that's been, he just barely started reading the Bible, and he's been coming to our men's Bible study, which if you don't go to something at 6:30 a.m. on Friday mornings, you can wake up, you can come fellowship, and it'll be fruitful for you, I promise. But he's been coming, and he's got all these questions, and it's just a normal thing. When a person starts to read the Bible and believe in Jesus, they want to have some sort of factual proof worked out. Did Enoch really leave the earth without dying? How's Abraham having a baby when he's 120 years old? How the world was flooded. People have all these questions, and they say, hey, well, I can't really have a relationship with God until these things are worked out. And that's not a necessary thing to have a relationship with God, partly because it's never been in Christian history the way that people engage God. Now, for those of you who were in midlife or maybe starting life around the 1980s and 90s, you grew up when there was a barrage of books that were basically aimed at explaining any sort of doubt away. There's nothing wrong with these books. I'm just going to mention some titles: The Case for Faith, More Than a Carpenter, etc. All these books were designed to be what are called apologetics, which basically explain all of these different things so that you can have some factual basis on how the Bible really is true and all of these different things. And one of the biggest problems with that is that that's not really the way the Bible is written. And that's not really the way the faith has ever worked out. If you can explain it, like I said last week, St. Augustine's quote, if you can explain it or comprehend it, we're not talking about God. God is beyond our understandings, our explanations, our facts that we know. The way that we initiate with God in a relationship is by coming how we are with what we have and having faith. And last week I talked about how faith is not the idea of having it all worked out and knowing that it's going to work out, but it's saying, I trust God, and so I take a step forward into the darkness and believe that even though I can't see or figure it out, He's going to be there and He's going to be with me and He loves me. I would even go as far as to say this, just this quick little, extra, that a lot of what growing in faith is about is coming to the understanding that God does love you the way you are. And there's nothing that you can do to make Him love you anymore. Amen. Generally, when we're trying to work things out, we believe that if I could only believe this, or if I could only have this much faith, or if I could only do this, then it would all work out, or if I only get my life together. Growing in faith comes to a place where you realize that it's by grace, not works, not intelligence, not, having it all worked out, but it's starting with what you've got and moving forward with into what God wants to, engage with you with. Think about some of the things that you've heard before. All you have to have is a faith the size of a mustard seed, right? Mustard seed is the smallest, one of the smallest seeds actually, but one of the smallest, but it can grow to a controllable weed-looking plant that's only good for a few things. I mean, that last part was probably unnecessary to say, but that's the truth about mustard. It can be out of control. Its roots go everywhere. You put it into a garden, you can't get rid of it. In fact, the Jews, actually, it's a controversial saying that Jesus said when he said that, because the Jews weren't even allowed to plant mustard in their gardens and things like that, because it would just overtake everything. But Jesus is using, an illustrative term that they understood, saying, if all you did was just start with what you have, it'll eventually just take over everything. So I want to read a passage, and I apologize up front that it's a little bit lengthy. Oops, forgot the timer. You guys might be in trouble because I did drink an energy drink, but it's Matt's fault. It's in Mark chapter 9, and it's a little bit lengthy, but I'm going to read it all, and I'm not going to pause or comment on anything, and then we'll just make a few observations about the whole story. But it's in Mark chapter 9, and it's known as the Transfiguration story, and it's also connected, in my opinion, to Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy. So if you want to turn there or just pay attention up here, it's up to you. So, Mark chapter 9, verse 2. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And he said this because he didn't really know what else to say because they were all terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved son. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them. As they walked down the mountain, he told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves, but they often asked each other what he meant by rising from the dead. Then they asked him, "Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes?" Jesus responded, "Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. Why do the scriptures say the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be treated with utter contempt? But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they chose to abuse him, just as the scriptures predicted." When they returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them. And some of the teachers of religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. "What is all this arguing about?" Jesus asked. One of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. And whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Jesus said to them, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought the boy, but when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening?" Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, "Since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can." "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asked. "Anything is possible if a person believes." The father instantly cried out, "I do believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit. "Listen, you spirit that makes the boy unable to hear and speak, I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again." Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd. People said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. Afterward, when Jesus was alone in the house with his disciples, they asked him, "Why couldn't we cast out the evil spirit?" Jesus replied, "This kind can only be cast out by prayer. Interesting story, I think. And some people would say it's two stories, but it actually connects by, Jesus coming down the mountain. And I'm not going to go through every little point of it. There's a lot of theology attached into this, and I don't want to get caught in the weeds. But let's just start with the mountain. The mountain the Mount of Transfiguration is what it's called, where Jesus was transfigured. And what it's talking about essentially is when Jesus took his inner circle of disciples. Some of the 12 were down there. We had Peter, James, and John, up with Jesus on the mountain. And they're up there. And it says that Jesus is kind of changed. The main giveaway was his cloak became so white that there's no way that he could have done a switcheroo on them, because it was gleaming in such a way that no laundry could have cleaned it for him. No bleach could have whitened it that much. It was something different. And it just, I just picture the disciples, they look around and they're like, wow, something weird is happening. And then all of a sudden, two ancient people who have been dead for a long time appear, Moses and Elijah. Now, just a quick little bonus. That's a significant thing in the text that you could study out later if you want. Moses represents the law. He's the lawgiver of God. And then you have, Elijah on this side, and he represents the prophets. So remember, the New Testament had been written. The only revelation of God that the people of Israel had was called the law and the prophets. And then you have Jesus in the middle, and it's a significant thing. So significant that Peter does not know how to act. And he says, you know what? This is wonderful that you brought us up here to see this. Let's never go back. Let me make 3 shelters to, as a memorial that this happened, and then there'll be one for Jesus and one for Moses and one for Elijah. I think you can go to that first slide, Ruthie. It would say something to the effect of, verse 5, I think. It's under all of the text. Yeah, it's not in the... So he says, Rabbi, let us, memorialize this place by doing it. And then it says, and sometimes not in the New Living Translation, but it'll be in brackets, which just means it's extra context. It says, he said this because he was very terrified, or they were all terrified. They didn't know what to say. You would figure that, because of the place that we stand in our knowledge about, Peter and God and Jesus and the crucifixion and resurrection, etc., that because Jesus wants everybody to have correct understanding and doctrine and have everything straight, that Jesus would have looked at Peter and say, hey, no, that's stupid. What's wrong with you? You want to create idols of these biblical heroes and, put me in a shelter too? But I love it. Jesus doesn't say anything. One of the things that we have to understand about God is that God puts, God puts up with who we are now and never leaves us behind. You don't have to improve at some unrealistic rate with your knowledge of God or, what you understand about the Bible. Go to some class, do some sort of thing that you're not ready for. What you think about God right now is okay. Now, I know people argue with me, protest me, send me emails and stuff like that, but you will never be able to prove me wrong about this, because the Bible, as a story from Genesis to Revelation, is God entering into time and space just ahead of the people of God and not forcing them to do anything, but pulling them forward into a new revelation. One of the questions that I always will remember that almost everybody had on their lips when I was in Bible school was, what about the people in the Old Testament? Are they in hell? Because you can get that idea. Jesus died in the New Testament. Whoever believes in him, well, what happened to all those people who died before? And they would ask teachers and try to have arguments and all kinds of silly things, like to have some sort of right answer and be the one who could really explain this. And one time we were in a class and everybody asked the teacher, and the teacher just said, Well, they had faith the Messiah was coming, right? And they're like, yeah. Well, then they had the same faith that you have because Jesus came and he died on a cross. And if you look at this, the disciples in this story, they had no idea what the resurrection was going to be. They had no idea that it was going to happen. They didn't understand everything. They have it all worked out. But Jesus never left them behind. He doesn't leave people behind the way we understand it. Like I say this so much that I'm astonished how many people don't catch it when I say it, but belief in the Bible is not intellectual assent or being able to memorize some sort of truths or being able to, explain some sort of complicated theology. Faith in the Bible is trust. It's conviction that you are able to act on what you believe, and you can't act on what you don't believe or haven't worked out yet. So God puts up with us, with who we are now, and he never leaves us behind. Go ahead and go to the next slide. In verse 7, it's interesting because right after Peter says this, Jesus doesn't say anything about it, but suddenly Moses and Elijah disappear, and it's just Jesus standing there, and a cloud envelops them. And then there's this word spoken from the cloud, which it doesn't say in the text, but we assume was from God himself. He says, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him." One of the things that we mess up about Christianity is we think that it's about like a theological concept that we have to memorize or, learn or know or go to Bible study and Sunday school and all this stuff, when really you could sum it up in this one thing. Do you listen to Jesus? Like, a lot of people miss this reading the New Testament. They're like, well, you've got to understand the 10 Commandments, and you got to understand this, and you got to understand the sacrifice system, and you got to understand all this. And, then they're like, and Jesus died on the cross, and then we're all going to heaven. And then they just erase all of the things that Jesus said. In fact, one of the primary things that I talked about last week, and thank you all for putting up with me while I was sick and the short sermon, but one of the primary things about like the Holy Spirit living inside of us is that it reminds us of the things that Jesus said. As Christian, our theological beliefs should be based upon one thing: Christ. What did Christ say? What does Christ think? What is the way that this is supposed to go according to Christ's perspective? That's what this crazy theological, mystical experience, that was the point of it. Like if you look, the disciples try to turn it on its head, and they're like, well, why do all the Pharisees say that Elijah has to come first? They were just up there with people who had been dead for hundreds of years. They had heard God's audible voice in a storm. And the point that they walked away with wasn't like, this is how all this works out. It's that, hey, look, you got the law, you got the prophets, and now Jesus is in charge. And then the cloud comes and it says, hey, look, this is my son, listen to him. The point they were supposed to walk away with, Jesus brings his inner circle up. I mean, he had some sort of like mission here. The point that they were supposed to walk away with was, this is my son, do what he wants. We have gotten so far away from this that it's ridiculous. We're not doing what Jesus wants. We're doing what a theological system, and many times in the last few years, forgive me for saying this, a political system says that we should be doing, when we're really supposed to be just fixated on what Christ wants us to do. Okay, you can go to the next one. So I want to skip forward to the story of the boy here. So Jesus comes up, and this is post him telling his disciples how to cast out demons, and they went on a mission trip, and they had great success. And his disciples had, at this point, become people who were going around and doing this in the name of Jesus in other places. And so the disciples he had left down that didn't experience this great thing that happened with the inner circle are down there, and a guy hears that Jesus' disciples are in town, and he has a a son who has been demon-possessed, basically. And it's pretty rough stuff. Like all of a sudden, he's walking with his son and he has like an epileptic type seizure. He starts foaming at his mouth. And as the story goes on, when he's talking to Jesus, he says whenever he's around fire or water, he tries to kill himself and throw himself into the fire. And it's definitely like a demon that's doing this. And so he hears Jesus' disciples are in town. And so he says, I'm going to take my son to the place where he can get healing. And it didn't work. It didn't work. It didn't happen. I don't know about you, and I just want to talk about this for a minute, but I'm not saying disappointment with the church because somebody is immoral or somebody's judgmental or anything like that, but when we have actual like needs and things in our heart and life, and we want to, get Jesus to heal them, and we pray at home and it doesn't happen, and then somebody says, hey, would you like prayer? And you're like, yeah, God's going to heal me right now. And I've had this happen a bunch of times. And I've you go and ask them to pray for you and it just doesn't work. Or at least what you thought was going to happen didn't happen. I mean, that's what this guy's dealing with right now. But it's even worse for this guy. And so Jesus comes and he says, what are you guys arguing about? And the guy says, I brought my son to your disciples to cast out the demon, and it didn't happen. He's kind of like saying, I bought this product, and now I'm bringing it back because it's not working. Disappointments can present reasons. It's not supposed to say themselves. Disappointments can present themselves as reasons for doubt. Like, I tried this. It didn't work out. I went to church. Things didn't get better. I started reading the Bible. I didn't understand it. I lifted my hands in worship and felt embarrassed. I prayed, that God would fix this relationship, and it just didn't work. And I've talked to people a million times where they're like, God told me in this church service that, he was going to give me my kids back and it didn't happen. Or God told me that I wasn't going to lose my house and I did anyways. And it's they just, I don't know if you guys are experiencing this or if I'm talking to the right crowd this morning, but this kind of stuff happens in real life. You think things are going to go the way you do because you believe with all the faith that you have, and then they don't. You don't know what to do. Is this whole thing fake? Is this whole thing not real? Is this my fault and God's punishing me? And all this just different drama that you can go through with it. Disappointments can present themselves as reasons for doubt, but are opportunities for faith in disguise. We think that faith is an instantaneous thing that just changes things in the moment when that's not the way it works. Think about what this guy went through. It's not just about the disciples failing. This is a big disappointment because he has brought his son who has been continuously going through this episode of stuff for years. Think about the judgmental pain that this man had to go through. He lived in a time where if you had a demon or if you had an affliction, even if let's just say this wasn't a demon, it was just some sort of epilepsy or some sort of thing that was causing this, people would have looked at him as he had sinned and brought this curse on his family. He knows he didn't. He just wants it to be over. He loves his son. I don't know. For those of you with kids, you can imagine if you had a son or a daughter or somebody that was going through this type of affliction, that it would be so emotionally draining that you wouldn't even know what to do. Every time I read this passage, I just think of the parents and people I know, of people who have drug-addicted kids or people who they love that are out there. It's almost the same thing. It's like all the moms and dads that I've met who have just tried to pray their kids into the kingdom, and it just never works. Something always goes wrong. Something always falls apart. Something is just why can't they get it together? I prayed hard, I fasted, I did all of these things, and it's like, Pastor, why doesn't this stuff work? All I know is this, and I can't say anything for certain, that faith is something that is meant to endure It's not a coin that we put in the vending machine that God gives us exactly what we want right back. In order to see God come through, we have to open our minds to what that looks like and be able to endure and trust that his goodness is better than our mediocrity. That he wants the best, not the worst. And there will always be unexplainable things. I used to love, like, the Simpsons when I was growing up. Anybody love the Simpsons? If you don't love the Simpsons, I mean, it's okay. You don't have good taste. But there always used to be a thing where, like, Homer Simpson would either kind of fake die or he would have a dream of dying or something like that. And he would see God and he would say, God, what is the meaning of life? And then it would just cut off right before he said it. I think sometimes we have to just prepare ourselves in our faith to realize that there's a lot of things we will not be able to answer. There's a lot of disappointments that we have that we feel are unfair and unjust, and we're going to have to wait until we stand before God to say why. And we also, and here's just a little quick suggestion, you have to have enough faith right now to ask God why. Some people have this dignant faith that essentially will never question anything about God. Well, sometimes you should be able to question God. If you think God's shoulders aren't big enough to deal with what your complaints and doubts are, then you don't understand God. He wants to dialogue with you about the things that aren't working out. He's not going to say, oh, you have doubt, boom, lightning bolt, you're dead. Sometimes part of our faith is being able to come to terms with what's wrong, go to God and say, I don't get it. Please help me understand it.
Amen.
But disappointments, they lead us into doubt. But sometimes I think that we have to understand that faith and doubt are part of, the same coin. They're just two sides of it. Doubts can spring up in our lives, but they're just disguises that are telling us, hey, look, we can have faith that God can overcome this. So, Jesus questions the father about, how long has this been happening? And the father tells him, hey, since he was a little boy, the Spirit often throws him into fire, into water, trying to kill him. Just have mercy on us and help us if you can. In that statement, I think you find a little bit of true humility and truth. He tried the disciples out, and it seemed like what people were saying about them wasn't true. I brought my son where I was supposed to bring him, and it didn't work out. But he's humbly saying, look, I'm not giving up on this. Will you please do something if you can? And Jesus comes back to him and he says, what do you mean if I can? Anything's possible for those that believe. And I love this guy's response. I'm not going to read it out. It's memorized because I love this story, but I don't like how the New Living Translation translates it. I like how the NIV and New King James Version translate it. The father instantly cried out. So Jesus says, anything's possible if you can believe. The father cries out, I do believe. Help my unbelief. Unbelief and belief exist together. And the best possible thing that you could do for your spirituality and your relationship with God is learn to be okay with that. It's how God woos us. It's how he proves himself. We like to think that it's just about overcoming all of our unbelief. Jesus challenges this guy. Look, you're disappointed. Things haven't worked out. Things aren't going the way that you want them to. But anything's possible for them that will believe. And the guy gives Jesus his total heart right back. I believe, but please help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. You can't engage God with something you don't have. You can't fake it until you make it. You can't have all of this, like, these knots in your stomach and heart and mind and just try to ignore that they don't believe and, like, pray a specific type of prayer that's going to make God do something. I used to always, like, preach and say, like, if people wanted something to happen, like, you know, I would say, prayer moves the hand of God. I don't believe that anymore. Prayer moves the heart of God. You can't move the hand of God. You can't make something happen you can't make God do something that is not what he wants to do or is planned to do or hadn't thought about doing. But you can move his heart. You can be the person that he created you to be, which is a person who's in communion or fellowship or relationship with him. You can hear from him. You know, one of the craziest, things I think about Christianity in our day and age is that, like, we are more about, like, getting God to do something through prayer rather than getting to know God through prayer. We think that prayer is like us telling God what to do instead of us opening ourselves up to hear what God is already doing. I mean, that's the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be open to the direction that God is going, and we experience life in the way that it is, with our doubts, with our problems, with our praises, with everything, so that we can be open to understand it all through him speaking to us. So I'll encourage you this morning this way, and I'll be done. Zach left me, so I'll have to sing or something at the end. But you can't have a relationship with God without starting where you're at. There's no class for you to take. There's no book for you to read. There's no doctrine that you have to understand. Faith the size of a mustard seed. You come to him and say, I'm here. I would encourage you, if you don't have a relationship with God, or you feel like you aren't sure about it, or you feel that you don't know what God is doing, or maybe your relationship with God has not worked thus far, tomorrow morning, just wake up without anything in front of you and just say, God, I'm here. And spend some quiet time. Maybe like you have a relationship with God and you've started and you know some of the things that you're supposed to do, like pray, read the Bible, etc. Stop acting like they're doing something to make God make your day perky and happy and that you're going to walk away with some sort of peace. Read, pray, spend time alone with God, but understand that he's trying to speak to you and move you. You can only start where you are. So don't let not being where somebody else is, not being where you think you should be, not having knowledge about a certain thing hold you back any longer.